And we are live.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the habilitation, or in Portuguese, agregação of our colleague João Claro, the second day. The title of the habilitation agregação is Strategic Design of Engineering Systems Under Uncertainty, and it's in Industrial Engineering and Management area. I would like to say we'll have a 2-hour session today. It will start with the presentation of maximum 1 hour by João Claro, followed by the discussion by Professor Richard de Neufil and Professor Madalena Araújo. And then the other members of the committee will be able also to intervene. So thank you very much for being here at the University of Porto, at FEUP, although in virtual mode. Thank you for all the work the colleagues in the jury have done, and thank you for all the technical support from the services of the faculty, and thank you for everyone that is following this event on the YouTube channel. So good luck for the presentation, João Claro. Thank you.
Is my sound okay?
Lovely.
Yes, and the presentation is on with not with the presenter view, with the slides view. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So the topic of this presentation is strategic design of engineering systems under uncertainty. So engineering systems are a class of systems that are aimed at fulfilling important social functions, and they are characterized by a high degree of technical complexity, elaborate processes, and social intricacy. They integrate technology, people, and services to provide solutions of value to the economy and society. And this interaction between technology, people, and organizations is also at the origin of some of the specific challenges that these systems face. An electric vehicle, for instance, will aim at providing sustainable transportation, and it will integrate a complex ensemble of technology in its platform, in its modules, with a wide array of processes in different areas, different natures, handling, for instance, energy and information, and involving people in different capacities in their design, their construction, or their operation. A supply chain for an electric vehicle will also have a key role in providing sustainable transportation, and it will link hundreds of suppliers for thousands of parts sourced from all over the world, namely through processes in areas such as product development, manufacturing, coordination, innovation, and involving people in complex organizations that will reside and will have an impact in regional economies. The design of these systems at the highest level, their strategic design, will typically be focused on key generic properties of these systems, on the decisions at the top of hierarchies of decisions, and is strongly determined by the technology and by the interdependencies in this system. In the case of an electric vehicle, these properties may be flexibility and safety. Major decisions may be made regarding the configuration of the platform and the modules. An electric vehicle core technology will lead to a very different architecture in terms of the parts and the relationships between them when compared to what happens with a vehicle that is based on an internal combustion engine. And this, for instance, will lead to new interdependencies emerging, as is the case in electric vehicles between energy storage, braking, and power electronics. For a supply chain in a similar manner, flexibility and scalability may be key properties of interest. Major decisions will be made on technologies, capacities, locations, the timing of their deployment. As is often the case, the organizational structure of the supply chain will mirror the technology dependencies of the underlying technology, and the activities in the supply chain, the way that they are sequenced, the way that they share resources, their complementarity or substitution relationships will establish also strong interdependencies. So this view of engineering systems and this view of their strategic design suggests that network models have a very important role in this context. In fact, looking at network representations of the technology core of each of these systems, they clearly suggest and illustrate how network models are appropriate to characterize their architectures of very complex technical systems. Network models are the most abstract and comprehensively descriptive modeling alternative, and they are able to elucidate important generic properties of these systems. In fact, network structures and their control mechanisms not only create advantages such as flexibility, they also create disadvantages such as vulnerability, and the tensions and the trade-offs between these advantages and disadvantages need to be better understood, need to be managed, and network models have an important role in assisting with this. Strategic network design has been mostly studied within specific domains, and some recent reviews have brought together the body of research in areas such as supply chains, waste reverse supply chains, water distribution, power transmission, telecommunications, and urban transportation. The review by Browning from 2016 is an exception. It is focused on studies with design structure matrix, one of the important tools to analyze the architecture of technical systems. It's a review that cuts across a variety of domains. The design structure matrix is a tool that builds on a matrix representation of a system with its components as the rows and the columns of the matrix, and the relationships between these components depicted in the off-diagonal elements of the matrix. This is then amenable to the computation of a number of metrics and to the application of various analysis techniques. In this context, several authors have suggested the need and the opportunity to go beyond work in specific domains and seek to integrate existing knowledge, greater generality, and then bring this back to enhance and broaden the application in different domains. In addition to the network structure, another important challenge for engineering systems is uncertainty. Due to their nature, they are exposed to a wide variety of sources of uncertainty, which include the complex impacts of technological change, the evolution in markets and industries, and the complexity of business systems. This then translates into significant future risks, but also significant opportunities. So the questions related to uncertainty that may be in the minds of the designers of an electric vehicle may be questions such as how will the foundational technologies for an electric vehicle evolve? What kinds of configurations will customers be interested in? How will new energy-hungry electric systems evolve, and how should we integrate them in our vehicles? For the designers of the supply chain, these questions may be related to how fast the demand will grow, how the regulation will change, and how competitors are evolving. The impact of uncertainty is amplified in the case of engineering systems by a number of additional characteristics that are typical of these systems. Their long lifetimes, for instance, electric vehicles and their supply chains are both multi-annual development and deployment endeavors. Reversibility with significant investment, billions of euros that are industry specific, or for instance, rigidities in the designs and the architectures of the vehicles and the supply chain. For instance, in the case of the electric vehicles, there's typically a balance that is very delicate within and between dimensions such as space, safety, efficiency, and evolution. And in the supply chain, changes to one part of the supply chain will typically be limited or limit what is happening in other parts of the supply chain. Finally, the multidimensionality of these systems also leads to the fact that different parts of these systems may be influenced in different ways by the uncertainty and will drive the impact of the uncertainty in the rest of the system also in a variety of different ways. Flexibility is the most important characteristic to cope with uncertainty. It consists of the ability to undergo a certain number of classes of change with relative ease. It comes typically at a cost that is related to additional resources or additional complexity, but it provides future benefits if the evolution of the future requires the exercise of that flexibility. And this can be targeting downside losses or the capture of upside gains. Flexibility can be usefully understood and regarded as a real option. This is an extension of the basic architecture and thinking of financial options to physical systems. In the case of an electric vehicle, flexibility can be brought in with, for instance, a flexible electric vehicle platform or a flexible platform combining electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine option. The latter might be best suited for an environment with high unpredictability in terms of electromobility. The former has the advantage of being less complex. For a supply chain, we could see here a similar possibility regarding the configuration of the plants, but we could also see the possibility of implementing volume flexibility with electric vehicle-specific part suppliers. Jointly, these options would be aiming at adjusting the production of the supply chain to specific configurations. So the exciting but difficult question that is in the minds of the designers is which flexibility modules or which network designs are appropriate for particular uncertainty environments. In the case of the electric vehicle, this question could be something like under which conditions we should use an internal combustion engine and an electric vehicle platform, or an internal combustion engine and a combined platform. In the case of the supply chain, the question could be related to how we should balance the capacity and volume flexibility of the suppliers with the capacity and product flexibility of the assembly. The difficulty of this vision suggests that it could be useful as an initial step to consider simpler networks and then develop intuition from the analysis of these networks. And this has been the agenda of the research in news vendor networks. News vendor networks are an extension of the classical news vendor problem, which consists of determining how many newspapers to purchase, knowing only a probabilistic forecast of the demand and considering a constant unit cost and unit selling price. And the extension leads to considering different products, different configurations of the processing, transport, storage network, and overall how to invest in a network based on a demand forecast with the possibility of deciding its best use when the demand is revealed. But this is just an initial step. So a next step, adding usefulness in terms of the design of engineering systems may be bringing in additional multidisciplinary detail related to the technical and social complexity of these systems, and that allows us to better analyze and better address the interdependency between components related to different disciplines. And this can be achieved with optimization and simulation approaches. And so this sets the agenda for the next two parts of this presentation. First, an overview of work that has been done with news vendor networks, and then some examples of optimization and simulation approaches that illustrate how this additional multidisciplinary detail can be brought into the analysis with usefulness and with advantage. So news vendor networks are stochastic linear decision model with recourse. You can see on the right-hand side an example of a news vendor network. So in this case, one that features discretionary common input. So input 1 in this network can be used to satisfy both demand 1 and demand 2, and the flexible processing resource. Resource 2 here can use both inputs 1 and 2 to satisfy demand 2. So these models are characterized by a probability distribution of the demand to be filled. The variability and the correlation of the demands are important parameters that we will look at in the presentation of the studies in this part of the lesson. They feature a linear technology to transform inputs into outputs and also a linear financial structure. There are 3 sets of decisions: capacity investment and input inventory procurement. These are ex-ante decisions. They are made before the certain parameters, in this case the demand, are revealed. And then there are activity decisions, and these are ex post. They are made when we already know the demand and certain parameters are revealed. As we can see, these models feature parsimony, they feature tractability, they are also effective in providing insights, but as we had already discussed in the previous part of the lesson, they are also too stylized for practical decision support. Now, looking at the example that we have here on the right-hand side, it's a simple example, but it has a characteristic that is very important. It's the fact that it features this discretionary activity, the possibility that we use input 1 to satisfy demand 2, and this is a possibility that would not be present in a deterministic setting. So it's something that only makes sense in an uncertain setting, and that we can only bring into the analysis and the model if we consider simultaneously the discretionary common input and the flexible processing resource. So I will divide the presentation of work in this area in 5 blocks. I will start with a presentation of the results for a set of canonical networks. So these are earlier studies that consider a dedicated network in which 2 resources are dedicated to satisfying each of them one of 2 demands. And then 2 networks that result from the additional integration of a shared flexible resource in the case of the serial network downstream from the dedicated resources, and in the case of the parallel network in parallel with the dedicated resources. In the second set of studies, we will look at the introduction of other sources of operational flexibility and uncertainty, discretionary activities, as we saw in the first example, as we were introducing the generic news vendor network model, volume flexibility, which allows producing above or below capacity at a certain cost, postponement, which brings leeway in the timing of decisions, and an additional source of uncertainty and reliability, which is reflected in the possibility of failure in the inputs and the resources. Third set of studies is focused on the impact of risk aversion. So these earlier studies are all made under the assumption of risk neutrality. So these studies look at how risk aversion has an influence on the design of these networks. Fourth set of studies looks at multiple decision makers, situations in which different resources are held by different decision makers. And finally, we will look at the results of a study that looks at the interaction between operational flexibility and non-operational flexibility. In this case, financial hedging and its interaction with postponement and with the product flexibility that is present in the parallel network. So starting with the canonical networks and looking at the dedicated network. So the main effect here is the fact that under risk neutrality, it simply breaks down into 2 separate news vendors problems, and the pattern is the pattern of the classic news vendor problem. So the capacity will increase or decrease in risk exposure according to whether the value to cost ratio is high or low. When we look now at the serial network, there are 2 important drivers that influence the behavior of this network. One of them is demand pooling, and this is the fact that in the shared resource, there is some usefulness in taking advantage of the fact that the demands have variations of opposite sign, and so they have some compensation in those variations, and this can be leveraged by this shared resource. And another driver is ex-post revenue maximization. This means that if we are satisfying two demands that have different profits, we can choose to use the resource to produce more of the most profitable product and satisfy the most profitable demand at the expense of the least profitable demand. In a serial network, important effects are complementarity and bottlenecks. So the upstream and downstream resources, they act as bottlenecks to each other. And so the pattern that we see emerged in a serial network is one of capacity investment. So in these networks, underinvestment in the shared resource is optimal. And capacity imbalance means that the resources are never fully utilized simultaneously. In this case, as it could be expected, the correlation increases the share of the shared capacity. So at negative correlations, the pooling effect will be dominant, and so the share of shared capacity will be lower. For the parallel network, we have the same drivers, but the effects here now are of substitution and redundancy. So the pattern here is different. In this case, correlation decreases the share of flexible capacity. However, the authors see that it does not disappear with perfect positive correlation, and that is related to the ex-post revenue maximization driver. So even with perfect positive correlation, flexible resource allows us to produce more of the most profitable product instead of the least profitable product. Now, looking at the patterns that emerged when we introduce other sources of operational flexibility and uncertainty, the introduction of discretionary activity leads to a configuration that is very similar to the serial network, whose results we have just seen. And so the pattern that we see here is one of unbalanced inventory and capacity. The dedicated input decreases, and all the other inputs and capacities increase. Goyal and Nettesin study the volume flexibility in a setting that is slightly different. So they consider endogenous prices in their model, and they establish a relationship of substitution and complementarity between the demands. There is still a role for correlation between the market size. So market size movements are influenced by this correlation, but there is now an important relationship, structural relationship between the demands in terms of whether they are substitutes or complements. So volume flexibility has an emphasis on capturing upsides, and so the authors identify here different roles for and importances for volume flexibility, depending on whether we are in a situation of complementary demands or substitute demands. In the case of complements, volume flexibility is especially valuable when there is positive correlation, because in this situation, the two markets will grow and their growth will be reinforced by the positive correlation. In the case of substitute products, volume flexibility is especially useful in situations of negative correlation, because negative correlation reinforces the single market growth that we see in a setting of substitute products. So finally, Tomlin and Wang introduce unreliability, and this is an important study because they look at the disadvantage from flexible strategies, and that is the fact that the flexible resource may fail, and so there is a resource aggregation disadvantage in these kinds of strategies. They study this by generalizing the parallel network setting. So they consider a broader setting with a number of demands that are both satisfied by the flexible resource and by a dedicated resource. And then they compare this setting with a network in which each demand is satisfied by two dedicated resources. So they find that in this dual source setting, the flexible design will be preferred with negative correlations due to the demand pooling effect, as would be expected, and also as would be expected with higher reliability. So in situations where there are less diversification benefits. They then compare this setting to a setting with a single source inputs, so either just one flexible resource or one dedicated resource supplying each of the demands. And here they find that the flexible design is always preferred. In this case, because in addition to the demand pooling effect, there is an upside effect, that is the fact that flexible success is more likely than full success with all the dedicated resources. And this outweighs the fact that the multiple dedicated failures are less likely on the downside, and they make the flexible design preferred. Tomlin and Wang also study risk aversion, as does Van Meegen later on. So they look at these different designs. In the case of the dedicated network, introducing risk aversion breaks the independence between the two resources, and a setting that is very similar to traditional financial portfolios emerges here with classic diversification benefits. And the pattern here is that the capacity moves toward the minimal profit variability resource as the risk aversion increases. In the serial network, the behavior of the dedicated resources is similar to what happens in the dedicated network, and overall this leads to the imbalance between the upstream and the downstream resources to be amplified. However, at very negative correlations, the authors actually see an increase in the shared resource that happens so that it avoids being a bottleneck to the resource with minimal profit variability that increases a lot in those circumstances. For the parallel network, they also see similar behavior in terms of the dedicated resources, and so risk aversion moves capacity mix towards the flexible resource. In their study that includes unreliability, Tomlin and Wang see some differences emerge due to the fact that risk aversion places a higher importance on losses. And this means that compared to the findings that we saw in the previous slide, when we have a dual source setting, the preference now for the flexible resource naturally decreases. And in the single source, where we had always a preference for the flexible design, now the dedicated design may become preferred with a higher importance that is given to losses under this circumstance. The two studies with multiple decision makers were made by Van Meegen and then by Goyal and Nettesin. The study by Van Meegen looks at the dedicated network setting and studies outsourcing circumstances starting from this setting. So in these circumstances, one of the resources can resort to the other to satisfy its demand. And Van Meegen studied how different contracts can be implemented and used to try to coordinate both the configuration of the network and the usage of the network. So he studies price-only, incomplete and state-dependent contracts, and he finds that all these contracts coordinate usage, but only the state-dependent contract can coordinate the configuration. Goyal and Nettesin look at a different type of settings. So look at competition. They frame the competition within a Cournot competition setting, so a setting in which the price is a function of the total supply. And overall, they find that many of the patterns that we see in non-competitive settings are also present here. So for instance, going from low to high uncertainty will lead the two competitors from having configurations with no flexibility to full flexibility. And then they have a number of observations that are different and specific of competitive settings. And one of them that I highlight here is the fact that according to expectations, as one of the players' dedicated costs increase, the value of flexibility for that player will also increase, so this is expected. But if the costs of a competitor increase, then the value of flexibility for the other player will decrease. And this is an effect that happens via competition. Higher costs for the competitor mean that the competitor will decrease capacity. By decreasing capacity, that competitor will be in a worse position to capture the deterministic component of the profit. And this means that there is more of that deterministic profit component for capture for the other player, which makes the flexibility less valuable. So finally, the study of João and others focuses on the interaction between financial hedging and postponement and product flexibility. In the relationship with financial hedging and postponement, postponement flexibility is understood here as having a lower upfront cost, and this means that there will be lower costs of excess capacity. The capacity investments will typically be larger, so there will be less shortage, and this means that the emphasis of postponement flexibility is on downside variability. And it's the same emphasis as financial hedging, so there is a relationship of substitution between both. Now, in the comparison with product flexibility, the relative role will depend on correlation. With negative correlation, the emphasis on product flexibility will be on the downside variability. So we will typically have very uneven demands with very salient costs of excess and shortage costs. And so the emphasis here is on the downside, and the role and the relationship will be also of substitution. With a positive correlation, there are more symmetric demands, so the emphasis is on upside variability, and these two sources of flexibility now act as a complement. So I have brought in this table together a summary of the main results of these studies, and so before moving on, just to close this part, I will present two additional examples. I would just like to make three observations. One of them related to the dedicated network is the fact that independence that we saw initially in the risk neutral setting is very fragile. It is then broken by different aspects that are considered. And so joint management of dedicated resources is something that is required. In the serial network, the focus is on imbalance, the fact that the resources are never fully utilized simultaneously. And in the parallel network, the focus is on how the mix of flexible and dedicated resources is changed by correlation and reliability and competition. So the two examples that I chose to close this part of the presentation are complementary to the studies that we have just seen, in the sense that they are focused on a great deal on platform and product configuration. So the first one is a problem of influenza vaccine selection, looking at decisions of strain selection and vaccine production, considering new recombinant technologies. So the demands here in this setting are the uncertain circulating strains, and the two technologies are a newer technology, recombinant technology, which has a shorter delivery time, and so introduces postponement flexibility in the setting, and the traditional technology that has a long delivery time. There is an additional source of flexibility here, discretionary activity that is related to the fact that vaccines may have immunization flexibility regarding a variety of strains. The authors observe that there is a complementarity between immunization flexibility in the vaccines and the newer technologies, and they argue that this challenges the current practice that consists of selecting just one strain for each vaccine. The final example in this part of the presentation is related to flexible product platforms and the trade-offs between research and development costs and customization costs in the choice of product platforms. So more specialized platforms will typically be aligned with specific product functionalities, whereas more flexible platforms will seek to cover functionalities of a product range that enable a lower cost of customization. So in this study, the authors consider two demands, a high-end demand and a low-end demand, both uncertain. They also consider risk aversion, and they look at the portfolio of 4 different platforms with 4 different flexibility profiles: a specialized low-end platform with low R&D costs and high customization costs to supply the high-end demand, a specialized high-end platform with high R&D costs and low customization costs, a platform with intermediate costs, and a very expensive in terms of R&D platform, but with very negligible customization costs. So they studied these different platforms and they conclude that all the individual platforms and some of their combinations may be optimal depending on the specific configuration of demands and costs. In this case, more flexible platforms may also be optimal in certain deterministic settings, and risk aversion favors the flexible platforms. So this concludes the overview of body of research in the area of news vendor networks, and I will now focus on 3 examples of work that we have carried out that is focused on introducing more rich detail into the analysis of this type of problems, in this type of settings. The first one is a study focused on transmission expansion planning with a focus on interconnections. It's a study that we focused on as a case application on the Iberian Peninsula. We consider uncertainty both in the supply and the demand, and we model this uncertainty considering different ways that the future may unfold in scenario 3. And we built this scenario 3 based on the visions for 2030 of the European network of transmission system operators. So you can see a graphic representation of this scenario 3 and the way that we have built it in the lower left part of the slide, with the 4 extreme visions that correspond to different rates of progress in the integration of the European energy market and the evolution in the European energy roadmap. And so these visions go from slow progress with low integration and low pace in terms of evolution, the energy roadmap, to a very fast pace and aggressive integration that lead to an extreme vision of a green revolution. So on top of how these different futures may unfold, we consider a more complex economic and technology configuration. We consider the transmission system operators of the 2 countries as leaders in a stack-over game, anticipating the actions that occur at the independent system operator level. These are market clearing and hourly dispatch. So as you can see in the graphic representation on the right, for one of the nodes in the scenario 3, there will be a number of standard operating scenarios, and this will correspond to typically different days of the week in different times of the year. And so in each of these standard operating scenarios, the independent system operator will work with a specific configuration of the network that is invested on by the transmission system operators, and market clearing and hourly dispatch will occur at this level. So we developed the simplified model of the Portuguese transmission network and interconnections with Spain, and we used as basic data the daily supply and demand bid from the Iberian market operator for the year of 2014, that then we changed according to how the macro evolution of the future development paths leading to each of those visions for 2030. So we use the essential parameters of how those visions develop to change the basic data that we had for 2014. So we model this as a mathematical problem with equilibrium constraints, and so some highlights of the results. The results that we had an initial set of expansions in the northern part of the country, and then a postponed expansion that would be contingent on an evolution towards green visions. And this highlights the role for the network structure that leads to these different expansions happening in different parts of the interconnection with Spain. The fair share allocation is based on the allocation of the expected net social welfare, and we can see the risk neutral regions. So you can see on the top right of the slide that these distributions can end up being highly variable. So both countries have the same expected net social welfare, but the distribution is highly variable, and that it can include negative values. This means that there is a role for risk aversion and even the consideration of other operational or financial flexibility that can be brought into the solution and into the model to namely address these losses. The second example is related to detail that comes out of the consideration of the physical context, and this is work done with Billy Pacheco on interannual wildfire management, which we modeled as a problem of multi-stage investment in a resource portfolio that has simultaneously fuel treatment and fire preparedness over an explicit landscape. There is an important relationship here between fuel management and suppression, and that's the fact that fuel management has an important influence in the efficacy of suppression, allowing suppression interventions to reduce the probability of having a large-scale fire. You can see on the bottom left of the slide a description of a typical solution on the landscape. So here the landscape is modeled by a 5x5 grid, and in each cell of the grid you can see whether or not there has been fuel treatment, if it was made in the winter, in the spring, whether or not there is a fire station in that cell, and if there is a fire station, how many hired ground crews and contracted helicopters we have there. Wildfires are the demand, and their modeling has two important components. One that leads to the severity of fire season. So in the description and in the figure on the right, the left part of that figure is representing the evolution of the meteorological climate weather conditions before the fire season, leading to different levels of severity for the fire season. And then there is a component of micro uncertainty that leads to the specific occurrence in terms of time, place, and severity of fires in the spatial grid. So we modeled this problem as a mixed integral linear programming problem. And we found that, for instance, the optimal budget and the value of postponement increased significantly, both with higher volatility and higher escape costs. On the top right of the slide, you can see the evolution of fuel treatments on the landscape according to the escape costs. So 4,000 on the left-hand side and 12,000 on the right-hand side. And then you have the differences between settings with low volatility and high volatility. And here, focusing on the low and high volatility, you can see that the number of fuel treatments both increases from low to high volatility, and that the proportion of fuel treatments that take place later in the year, in the spring, also increase from low to high volatility. We found that the suppression to prevention budget ratio is highly sensitive to the escape costs, but mostly insensitive to volatility. And that is clearly seen in another analysis that we did, and that is represented in the chart in the lower part of the slide, where we see how the prevention budget and the suppression budget evolve according to the level of escaped fire extended costs. This behavior has some patterns that led us to identify 4 different stages here that we related to specific social ecological contexts. So for very low costs, this can be representative of a setting such as shrublands, where there is really no specific value that is at risk in this kind of setting. And so it's not worthwhile deploying prevention or suppression efforts. As the values that may be at risk increase, and so the escaped fire extended costs also increases, we may enter a setting such as an abandoned forest situation, and here some level of suppression may be now already interesting. As we move, for instance, towards a setting with protected and planted forests, the values increase once more, and now we have a combination of prevention and suppression. As they increase even more, we may be entering a setting as, for instance, the wildland-urban interface, where there are human values, and here we still have a steady presence of the prevention budget, but the suppression budget now grows a lot, exactly because of the high human values that need to be preserved. The final example that I would like to present is related to policy context, and it's a study of how physical and political systems in wildfire management interact to influence how resources are allocated to prevention and suppression. So we model a physical subsystem where we have uncertainty in meteorology and ignitions, which lead to the severity of the fire season. And then the combination of the fire season severity and fuel accumulation will influence the area burned. In the policy subsystem, we represent the influence of human decision-making on how the budget is managed. And we also represent the influence that very extreme fire seasons have on leading to subsequent government action. So we have modeled this as a system dynamics model, and what we have found is an archetype of these kinds of systems that is called the firefighting trap. And so it's a situation where what is apparently sound management can have unintended consequences. In this case, the apparently sound management is increasing suppression as an instinctive response to the worsening severity of fire incidents. This directly treats the symptoms of fires, that pleases the public, but it's simultaneously crowding out preventative fuel management efforts. This leads to the exacerbation of fuel loads, which then combined with volatile severe seasons leads to great fires that overwhelm suppression capacity and further balloon suppression expenditures. So this trap that is called the firefighting trap leads to a behavior in which the focus is on fixing problems and diverting the attention from their prevention, which ends up degrading long-run effectiveness. We experimented with different balances between suppression and prevention, and we found that a more balanced budget utilization between the two can mitigate self-reinforcing consequences of the trap and better manage long-term damages. So to conclude, I would like to point out some work directions that I found suggested by the literature, either by trends in the work or explicitly in the literature that was involved in this lesson. And one of them is the bridging of literature. So this is something that we have seen clearly being done more intensively, more deliberately, based on the awareness that these kinds of settings have a diversity of resources with diversity of financial and operational characteristics. So we must build on a previous literature that has been looking at these different resources to build better analysis. We have seen also increasing recognition of contributions from other literatures across the domains, and some promise in looking in a complementary way at different types of research: analytic, optimization, simulation, and empirical research. There's work being done and to be done still in model building, representation, analysis, and interpretation. Uncertainty modeling has been pointed as an area that needs to be improved, in particular with more structured approaches, for instance, considering graph-based representations of dependencies and causal relationships between random parameters and decision variables. And this kind of representation allows incorporating data, but it also allows incorporating expert understanding and making a better and more explicit use of all these contributions. Simplification and ways of identifying and isolating the distinct networks and relationships between them in network representations are also an area where improvements would be welcome, as well as the creation of a catalog of pattern and standard metrics to analyze characteristics and performance of these networks. Several of these components still have important work to be done in terms of flexibility, understanding the impact of different levels of flexibility, studying in greater detail what are the costs and what are the benefits of flexibility. So for instance, coordination costs or economies of scope are important aspects that deserve more study. How different types of flexibility interact, what happens when you sequence them in terms of deployment in different ways. The boundaries of the analysis that have been carried out so far can also be explored to enrich the treatment of aspects such as demand, supply, and inventory. Still work that can be done in terms of the structure and detail of these models, linking them better to control levers that are available for designers and managers in the real world frictions, learning effects. Also, a lot of work to be done, extending these findings to dynamic multi-period analysis, more work in situations with multiple decision makers, with cooperation, competition, issues of trust and risk aversion, and still also work that can be done in improving optimization and simulation tools. Finally, there's some emphasis on empirical studies as well that might be valuable, allowing longitudinal empirical exploration of the developments that are hypothesized in many of these studies, but also in understanding existing networks. What are the decisions and constructs behind these networks? And why do these common patterns emerge? For instance, do they emerge because they are the best combinations of systemic performance and computational efficiency in their design? There are two additional areas of our work that I would like to highlight to conclude, and that have a relation also with this topic. So some of our earlier work was focused exactly on the types of challenging features that these problems have: uncertainty, the scale, lumpiness, etc., and addressing them and analyzing them with algorithms that are very flexible in terms of the type of models that they allow building, and also interesting from the point of view that they allow quite fast, reasonably efficient implementations and then fine-tuning for high efficiency. Another area of work is related to studying how these systems or systems based on these tools are then used in practice. And so an interesting work that we did here was reviewing how these kinds of systems in wildfire management evolved, are being used in practice. And here we found that in spite of some limitations, they are able to provide some reliable information to policies and activities. They are especially useful in assisting in the quantification of relevant factors and tracing complex relationships with usefulness for multiple stakeholders in wildfire management. However, they have had feeble adoption and issues of compatibility between the required capabilities to carry out this analysis and the abilities that exist in agencies. So this has been a hurdle, and compatibility with the values, norms, past experiences and needs of the actors and these agencies, as well as the fact that they struggle with the inherent uncertainty and ambiguity in the outputs of these tools. We have seen also promising developments in using these tools as part of broader risk governance frameworks. Using these tools together with other tasks of risk assessment, risk identification, risk communication, with broader participatory work involving multiple stakeholders, and also developments in terms of managing the implementation processes of these kinds of tools in a more informed way. And so to wrap up, as I usually do in my classes, I would leave kind of a homework slide with some due next tasks. And these would consist now of going back to the electric vehicle and electric vehicle supply chain examples, and now thinking of what could be an initial step in analyzing these examples. How would you configure a news vendor network model to analyze each of these? What kinds of intuition would it be relevant, potentially feasible to explore for those models? How could the analysis resulting from those models be useful to decision makers? And then thinking of a next step of enriching with detail these models. What details should we prioritize? How could it be incorporated in an optimization or simulation analysis? And how could this enhanced analysis be useful to decision makers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's now the time for the questioning, and I would like to ask Professor Richard de Neville, Professor of Engineering Systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to start his questions or comments, and I would like to thank him for being here and for helping us in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate and am honored by the invitation to participate in your kind of examination, which does not occur in the United States. So it's, and I admire it, and I appreciate how it contributes to the excellence of the higher levels of the academic structure in terms of being full professors. So thank you very much. And I also personally appreciate the opportunity to learn from your presentations and your comments and questions. It's very interesting for me, a very interesting exchange of ideas, and I appreciate this very much. And I'd like to start with some comments about the presentation before I ask any questions, because I think that Professor Claro needs some amount of rest before he can start on a new topic. So I'll start with, I'm very, very impressed with the sweep and continuity of the presentation. Frankly, I learned a lot. It put a lot of sense for me in how the various contributions were organized. I personally appreciated the graphic suite of how the various contributions and changes and additions to the sort of newspaper problem, that basic core problem was represented. and the summary of the understanding of the contributions. And I hope that João will permit me to use this presentation in my own adoption in my own discussions about flexibility and design. And I'm grateful to him for bringing this out. So thank you very much for that, João. It's an excellent contribution. Before proceeding to the questions, I'd also like to make a comment both relating to the initial presentation of the firefighting model that you showed, where you had the technical elements on one side and the social elements on the other, and relates also to a discussion that Professor Pavoa initiated yesterday, and I would have commented on if I had not been required to attend to my last class and left early yesterday, which was a whole issue about the difficulty she was suggesting, or maybe I've interpreted it wrong, but the whole difficulty of bridging between, on the one hand, technology studies with an influence on the policy, and the policy or economic approach would have some influence on the technology. And I loved the way that João talked about the notion of bridging of literature. I think that in many ways, in the issues that we're looking at system design and management and operation, that this need to bridge literatures and more deeply to bridge the educational formats that we have is really important. That is, that there are all kinds of situations where simply thinking about it a system as a technology artifact, whether it's an electric power distribution or satellite communications or other kinds of communications, is not dealing with the full problem. That it is clear that if we are going to be operating such systems, they exist in a legal context, in a financial context, in a regulatory context, in a social context, which will impact on their possibilities, on their appreciation of what they perform for the different range of stakeholders, whether they are the users, one set of stakeholders, the producers who want to have a financial benefit, whether the social construct is involved. And unfortunately, for reasons of efficiency or tradition, much of our education and practice is divided into fairly narrow groups: chemical engineers, civil engineers, economists, which traditionally in many ways don't share much together, even though they are approaching the same kind of problem in different pieces. And it is more striking, I think, that in certain forms of education, as I've encountered, for example, in Britain and the Netherlands and in Germany, that the whole preparing of the future leaders in technology is inherently narrow. My colleagues in Cambridge were telling me that he was appalled that some of the students that came over from the United States didn't want to study only physics. So they were interested in maybe studying Shakespeare, for example, or British history, or other views aside from the technical aspects. And I think that in many ways, our task ahead of us in the generation to come is in many ways to enable our students and our professionals to have a broader view of tackling these problems. So back to the notion of bridging of literature, I think that this is a really important aspect of the way we should be dealing with the attacking and working with the question of design and operating of engineering systems. And I really appreciate the way that Professor Claro has been doing that in his research, but also in the way his curriculum of, on the one hand, teaching people with technical backgrounds about the business side of it and teaching people with business background about the technical side of it. And I admire his determination to proceed in this area, a path which is not the obvious path within academic careers. So thank you very much for all that, João. That's a great contribution, I think. Now, let me talk a little bit, or let me ask a little bit about the several notions as concerned with flexibility. And one of the ones I want to talk about, or want to ask about, is that notion that flexibility costs. Now, it is true in some ways that if you buy insurance, which is a form of a flexibility, an optionality, that is an ability to get rid of bad things, a put option, but it costs. But is it optimal? That is, so if we think about it from a purely economic analysis, buying insurance from an insurance company is suboptimal. It's suboptimal because on the expected value basis, we would, if we could live a long, long time and replay the game many times, expected value favors the insurance companies. That's why they exist, to make money, because they can sell a product which costs them less than the amount that they will that they get from it. So from an individual point of view, my expected value for life insurance is negative. I should not be buying it. And yet I do. So why is this? João, would you sort of comment on your thoughts about what it is about the economic optimality of not having insurance, with the fact that most of us like to buy insurance and think that this is a good investment? Could you start off with that, some comments on that proposition?
So I think it goes back to the point that you mentioned, that this is not a situation that is going to happen. These are situations that are not going to happen multiple times, and so the final outcome is just related to some average of what happens in those multiple instances. And so let's call it the objective function, or the way that we assess these situations, does not correspond to that classic way as they will be assessed in some literature and in some settings. In some settings it may make sense, but for that kind of situation it does not make sense. And so this is then the reason why some of these studies start to introduce other profiles in terms of the risk attitude of the decision maker, and so they introduce, for instance, risk aversion as an additional and important concern, and obviously risk aversion is only looking at one part of the outcomes here. But the way that the decision makers can look at the potential distribution of the outcomes can be even more complex and richer than that, and that can lead, for instance, to the interest of just looking at the whole distribution of outcomes and not just one or two specific parameters.
Well, absolutely, and let's continue that discussion. Which I agree. It is that there's a lot of talk in the literature about optimality, and a lot of Van Meegen and the newspaper problem is, what is the optimal solution? But the optimal solution may ignore the notion of risk, and that notion of risk reward that many of us and companies and others decide, well, it's worthwhile to have a somewhat less profitable solution on average because we are concerned about the impact on the negative side, whether it's we have big fires, for example, and that hurts a lot of people, or a pandemic, that there is a notion that simply looking at economic efficiency in a way, which has been traditional in many years, that is not a complete approach. That it is really possibly not appropriate even to think that we can optimize these solutions, because we cannot have a way of trading off the average economic performance with whatever that feeling of risk reward is. That if you can do that in pure economics, finance, by thinking about the optimal performance and where you are on the risk reward frontier, but when you and I and companies and governments make decisions about risk reward, they don't have those kinds of measures. So we cannot really talk about optimizing between economics and risk distribution or risk reward. Could you comment on that thought?
So I believe that there is still some usefulness for these kinds of studies. If they are used, and I think that that's the most important value that you take out of these. They are useful in building intuition. And so, for instance, when you use these models and you look at how the designs change according, for instance, to the level of risk aversion, you can learn interesting things. You can learn important things about the behavior of model, and can be helpful. In a more informed and in a broader way of looking at these problems in the kinds of settings that you mentioned. So I would look at these models not as the single prescriptive tool, but as part of a tool set where they have a role jointly with other tools. And I would see that the role here is really helping you develop some intuition and some better understanding of how different designs, different modules interact with each other to produce a certain behavior in this kind of setting. So I would not say that their usefulness is identifying the optimal configuration of the optimal behavior. I think that they should be used in a broader optimization or simulation analysis stance or framework to help you achieve a better understanding of the system. So I would say that in that sense, being aware of the limitations that they have, as you were mentioning, and so being able to moderate or to contextualize better the results that they provide, taking into consideration their limitations, I believe that they can be an important and useful tool.
I completely agree with that. And the notion of taking a subset or a portion of the problem, the economic portion, for example, and optimizing it within its context can give a lot of intuition and understanding of those pieces. But at the same time, we should probably be aware when we're thinking about actual designs of satellite communication systems or electric power grids, rather, is that we can't really do optimization in a full sense, because we have to think about a variety of other issues, for example, of distribution of benefits, distribution of costs, and we are really pushed towards the idea that we need to have with us, accompanying the notion of optimization at some level, role of simulation. So what really happens and how does that affect the different stakeholders? And it's not just what's an overall economic value, but, well, the example of Spain and Portugal, the network, who's benefiting it and what's the fair distribution and how do we think about that? So that I think that I appreciate your take on the notion that optimization is good, but optimization is not the real answer. That it has to be combined with an exploration of the distribution and the multidimensional evaluation. There are certain things which are not fully comparable. The impact upon one set of stakeholders on another, and the government interest, and the people's interest, and so forth, are all part of the decision-making and policy-making exploration, which requires us in turn to think that this is not a technical problem alone or an economic technical problem alone. It is a social issue. And if we're going to deal with this appropriately, we must develop that kind of thoughtfulness or understanding or sympathy for empathy with the different dimensions. So thank you very much. I think I'd like to close with one.
Richard, if I may comment on that, that's exactly one of the points that that was on a later slide on that review that we carried out of how wildfire management, decision support and risk handling systems have been used. And so this more recent trend and the type of usage that has been promoted in what I call there a broader risk governance effort, but it's the using these tools as part of a tool set that brings together different stakeholders, fire program managers, incident managers, populations, municipalities, that brings them together and facilitates their work together in exploring different scenarios, exploring different alternatives, bringing into the design of the solutions the different inputs, structuring how those different inputs are provided. So that's the kind of usage that has been suggested and that has been increasingly fostered for kind of tools specifically in the wildfire management area.
Yes, indeed. Your student, Tiago Oliveira, as director, what's the official title of AGIF, the firefighting new institution, and his simulation that he's been working on with colleagues as in some ways making Portugal a leader in thinking about exactly that, not just the optimization of portions of it, but how does it affect the different regions. And I think this is an excellent indication of your contributions. I'd like to ask one final question, or at least pose an issue for you to consider. So you had marked in some place that flexibility will typically have a cost. For example, oversizing components for a potential future. And I think that we need to think more deeply about that in some ways. That is, let me refer to the example of the Blue Cross Blue Shield building in Chicago, which started off as a 30-story building, which after 10 years was expanded to be a 57-story building. So it embodied, in its first phase, the capacity, the overcapacity, if you will, to build it from 30 stories to 57. And if you looked at it as a 30-story building, it is possible to think, well, that's oversizing and that's costly, so that shows that flexibility costs. But I'd like to turn this on its head, that if you take a responsible system designer for that structure and its purpose it was supposed to use, and you only had one shot at it, one possibility of doing it, you would not say, I'm going to build a 30-story building, recognize the uncertainty of the future. You might not build 57, but you might build 40 or 45 or some other number. So I think the comparison often is not looking at the present size and says whether it's overcapacity for future handling, but to say that in fact, because there was flexibility, Therefore, you could afford not to build a larger one that you would have done as a prudent manager to compare for some future capacity. So the right comparison is to say that there's a 30-story building with the strength to do whatever it might need to do, compared to a 45 or something building, which was much more expensive. So I find, at least this is my thought, but I'd appreciate your comments, that in fact, flexibility by allowing changes in future capacity or dimensionality or productivity, which can be deferred, in fact, save money. But it is not the same thing as buying an insurance program, which you actually have to pay extra cash for. It, in fact, in terms of your capital expenditure, your effort at the beginning, saves money because it defers the decision of what you have to do and the money that you have to spend. What are your thoughts on that?
Very simple. I fully agree with you. And my point in highlighting the fact that there is a cost is just pointing out that so there are elements of flexibility that are intrinsic in the systems. So they are just there, and you can leverage them. And there are components of flexibility that you include deliberately in the system. And so that means that you need to add extra resources or that you will need to add some extra complexity to the system. But I share the same view that we have. I don't look, although they were in different bullets in my slide, I don't look at these as different, standalone things. You need to have to think of them in an integrated manner. So what you are doing is you are adding value to the system. So that's what you are doing in an integrated way. So I fully share your view. And my point there was just that if you want to deliberately include it in the system, then you need to add resources, you need to add complexity, but when you do that, you are adding value to the system.
Well, yes, I would, again, my twist is slightly, and then I think it's my time is up, is that in the choice of the original phase, you can either have it with flexibility, which has special features, or without, which in which case, if you have any responsible action towards the uncertainty, you will have made it already with some of them. So you'll have spent something on providing for the future. And the question is not the 30-story building with or without, it's the 30-story versus something that otherwise provides for the uncertainty, but doesn't provide because it gives any flexibility, but provides by actually spending the money. So that, and I emphasize this because it seems to me that a lot of the objections to flexibility is along the lines of some of my colleagues have said is flexibility is nice, but it costs money, we can't afford it. And if you think about what you do otherwise, because you are providing, design will provide for future needs in some way, is instead of having flexibility, they spend largely on providing the capacity in its full amount. So thank you very much for a really lovely class. I learned a lot from it, and I hope you'll agree to let me use the results, your presentation, your elements of your presentation in my own classes. Thank you very much.
They will be on your email as soon as this session is over. It's a great pleasure and an honor. I was a student in your classes, so and you know how much I admire you and those classes, so it would be an honor. It would actually be the second time that a piece of work that I have been an author of would be used in classes at MIT. Our paper on the firefighting trap has been used in John Sterman's systems dynamics classes, so it would be an honor to have a second set of materials being used in classes at MIT and even more in your classes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's the time to introduce Professor Maria Madalena Teixeira Araújo at the Department of Production and Systems of the University of Minho. Thank you very much for being here. and for the next discussion and questioning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to greet the president of the jury and all the other members, of course, with special thanks to the Department of Industrial and Management Engineering Director, José Fernando Oliveira, for this invitation. I'm very honored with it. And it has been a very enriching experience, especially with such a high quality candidate like João Claro, which is very rewarding. And I would like to salute the audience as well, acknowledging the importance of this and the relevance of this habilitation exam. Finally, saluting the candidates, of course. The reason for all of us being here. It's nearly finished, João. We are approaching the end. It has been quite interesting, and this class really was a very interesting lecture. I was very curious to see how would be the lecture itself with the summary that you provided to us. And in fact, it's the very high quality slides, no doubt about it. A lot of work there, and it made clear, much clearer, the summary that I had in advance to read about. So congratulations, of course, on such a good class for such a long time and such a constant tone of and fast. That was great. Thank you very much. I was following Professor Richard Nuffield discussion with you before, and I was very, it would be interesting to intervene as well, to talk all of us about all these topics, because it's very interesting listening about flexibility. I had here a question prepared in advance for João, which was, how would you comment if someone would say to you that flexibility is only needed if the decision maker is risk averse? Do you think that makes any sense? Such a comment, such a statement?
It does not, and so we clearly saw some examples here of how flexibility is relevant under uncertainty, even when the decision maker is risk neutral. So those first examples of the canonical networks that we saw, the demand pooling effects or the ex post revenue maximization effects, they make flexibility useful under uncertainty, even if the decision maker is not risk averse. So then it has a different value, and that's different value when you have a risk averse decision maker. But there are clearly a number of situations and effects that lead to flexibility being of value, even when the decision maker is risk neutral.
Okay, that brings us to the definition, to what's the meaning of risk and what's the meaning of uncertainty as well, in different fields that can have a different meaning. And I saw also some of the studies that you were using in the literature review and talking about regret as well, including regret in the modeling approach, risk averse, and also regret. That, as you know, of course, I think it is the study of Van den Broek and the 2018 paper. As you know, that is a possibility of artificially eliminating or attributing probabilities to the outcomes, isn't it? To the results. But there are also other methods that could be used instead of the regret. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, so when you look at the literature, there's you see a variety of alternatives. Sometimes it's not very clear why the authors use one or the other. Well, sometimes it's clear because it's because of issues of tractability. So some of these alternatives are more amenable to an easier or a feasible analytical treatment, for instance. So sometimes they might correspond, in fact, to different profiles of how the decision maker or the set of decision maker looks at these problems. They might even, and coming back to one of the points that I was discussing with Richard, they can be complementary. So you can they model different ways of looking and understanding what happens on the downside, and so they can even be complementary. So they model slightly different things or slightly different attitudes. So you can use them in a complementary way and also try to derive some intuition from that. But you see regret, you see, for instance, loss averse. So sometimes the focus is just on the negative results, not just on the downside. So my reading is that sometimes it's the school of the authors. Sometimes it's the advantages in terms of tractability, or sometimes they do in fact represent different aspects in terms of how the decision makers look at the downsides and what they are specifically concerned with.
Yeah, in your paper, Delgado y Claro, 2013, you used a loss random variable, right? So that's also an approach to deal with this kind of problems, right?
Yes, so we use conditional value at risk. So that's a risk measure. It's let's call it a high quality risk measure because it's easily implementable, and so here for reasons of tractability, it's very easily implementable in optimization models, and then it has a number of the good characteristics that risk measures should have. So it's considered an appropriate risk measure, and so it was the convergence of these two advantages, the fact that it is easily implementable in an optimization model, and they're good characteristics. It's good characteristics that led us to use that measure specifically.
Great. This also comes a bit from the previous discussion, looking at the models you presented and the solution, the main outcomes, and comparing the work you have done as well. Is there any room for qualitative research there? Yesterday we talked, I think it was Professor Carlos Engler about that, who was talking about your move. You started in your PhD a very quantitative researcher, looking for optimization, optimum models, and so on. And then you have been evolving and adding some qualitative analysis, some qualitative research as well to your research. These models you presented today, I couldn't see qualitative aspects there. Maybe I didn't read all the papers, of course, but what can you tell us about the introduction or the possibility of adding qualitative research relevant to this topic, as Professor Richard Neville was saying. It's not only optimization that is important. You have to deal with several aspects, and you are not going to find an optimum solution, but you are going to deal with different stakeholders with different needs, and you are going to adjust to the different stakeholders that won't be able to be done by optimization. But what are your comments about this qualitative research?
I think that there is ample room for qualitative research related to aspects that are addressed in these models, related to how tools that are based in these models can be used in practice. So, for instance, in the wildfire management paper with Abili Pacheco, we have not carried out robust and well-structured qualitative research on a number of considerations that we have brought to carry out the interpretation of the results of the model. But that's, for instance, one area where more rigorous parallel work with qualitative research and quantitative methods would have synergy. So, for instance, our interpretation of the what's happening in those 4 stages that we call, different socio-ecological environments or contexts. That's, for instance, one area where definitely we could go back and forth between a more quantitative exploration and a more qualitative exploration. So, trying to understand if those results happen in practice as we see them in the model, and if the causes that we are hypothesizing and the mechanisms that we are hypothesizing that are leading to those outcomes are actually there, are actually present. If they are not, can we improve our understanding of what the mechanisms are? And so can we bring that back to the more quantitative models and improve our work on the quantitative side? So that's, for instance, one area where this kind of joint work between a more qualitative area and a more quantitative area could be useful in the scope of work that we have been doing.
Yeah, that kind. Are you talking about Delphi groups with experts or things like that to discuss and help you understand deeper what's going on?
Yes, it could be Delphi groups. Yes, we have also been working with case research, and so it could be more classic interview based, or we could be even a bit more ambitious here. And because some of us, so for instance, Abílio, and as Richard was mentioning, Tiago Oliveira, who is now the head of AGIF, and other people who have a strong scientific preparation and have a good understanding of how scientific research and policy and management work can work together in a synergistic manner. So I think that working with people with these characteristics in these kinds of environments may facilitate a more ambitious, it has its issues, but even a more ambitious research approach, something more ethnographic, of having people really embedded in these environments and going through the experience of 1 year of wildfire management in Portugal, in different regions with different actors, and so being there in the middle of all this activity and all this action, and then being better able to bridge between more quantitative work and this kind even of more ambitious qualitative work.
I find it interesting you are saying more ambitious. Do you think this is a common path in for an engineer? From my experience, I would say that open-minded scientists or engineers growing more and more mature will look at qualitative research as very important approaches to explore specific contexts and go deeper in understanding the phenomena under study. But I would say that this is a common trend. I don't know if it is a common, but this would be a trend if people are willing to open minds, right? This will add different knowledge to the problem, and maybe not generalizable, but will still relevant to the quantitative approach favored by engineers. You are saying that you are in fact assuming that it will enrich the research outcomes and contributions from what you said, and you are very cautious saying also that you will bring people and researchers that already have background in this qualitative research. So you are not assuming that you yourself alone would be able to do it, because it's a different kind of study. Nobody can grasp all the specificities and all the methods. So it is very interesting. I look at that as a very positive, a very important way of looking at these things. But what do you think? Do you think this would be a common path in engineering, or has it become now more common to see people, scientists or engineers with a very quantitative background evolving to some mixed research, coupling qualitative methods with quantitative methods?
Oh, I can only give you my personal impression. I don't remember. I think that it would be very interesting to have a study on that. I don't know if you know any studies on that, but my personal impression is that yes, that is the trend. Even trying to discount the bias that I have from the fact that I am more aware to the existence of that kind of work. And I remember being younger and hearing about people that were working in those areas. I remember, for instance, our colleague António Lucas Soares, who did his PhD on socio-technical systems, and I remember back in 2000 hearing about his work and thinking that this was a very strange topic. But so even discounting that, the bias, the fact that I have a heightened awareness for it, my personal impression is that yes, there are more people, there are more organizational units that are located in areas that foster and benefit from this kind of work, and I think that will continue to grow. That will continue to grow for the future. So technology and engineering are omnipresent nowadays. Yes. So it's very difficult to disentangle technology from other areas of society and the economy. So it's very difficult to become a good engineer if you don't have a good grasp of how these things interact, and you need to use the right tools to develop knowledge about other aspects beyond technology. So I think that's going to be an increasing trend.
Thank you. In fact, I don't know any study done about it. I have only at least 10 years of teaching research methods to engineering students from different backgrounds, and I can see the difference. Their motivation is in several courses, coming from different backgrounds, is different, and in some cases it's very difficult to motivate them for qualitative reading, for qualitative research, in the sense of analyzing readings from a different area than their specific topic of study, which is a very closed-mind approach. But that happens because also the students are not yet mature, in the sense that they didn't see anything apart from their field of study, and so they need to grow and so on. But if you know a lecturer that has done a PhD and starts and does independent research and moves on, I think that is more common, that people are aware of the importance of going deeper into any analysis and bringing the social aspects to the research. That is more and more important. So I don't know any study. I have only some experience, and some backgrounds are for some of the backgrounds is more difficult to attract them to qualitative research and qualitative readings. Okay, it was only this. But as you said before, in some of the courses, the students the students can see a different reality and are attracted to different backgrounds, like the course we talked about yesterday, the one the report you prepared for the course on innovation that we discussed yesterday. That kind of approach that you adopt for that course is really motivational and is putting the students facing problems they never tackled before, and they have challenges that they can surpass only with different techniques that they didn't use before, and they will need some kind of qualitative analysis as well in what they are doing. That is a kind of course that is giving them insights into this avenue that has been opening up, and the engineering systems division at MIT is also an example of the sort of work that multidisciplinary teams can do a very interesting job. Because they put people together from different backgrounds and they look at the same problem with different visions, and so it's very enriching. Difficult of course, but very enriching. Okay, I think I finished my part. I'm ready to move to give the floor to any other members that would like to ask questions to João. Thank you very much, João. I'm very happy with your performance. I'd like to. I learned, of course, I learned a lot as well, and I wish you a very successful future in University of Porto and in the world. Of course, you are a world scientist. Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much. I will go again to the edital of the habilitation, and I will ask Stephen if he wants to raise a short comment or question, and a short answer or a short comment by João.
Thank you. I will try to make a short question. It's up to João how to answer it, I guess. But again, thank you for the opportunity and privilege of being here, and I'd like to congratulate João Claro on a great presentation. Well done. It was well presented. The content was solid all the way through. So well done. My question has to do with the generalization or application of these kinds of models on entrepreneurship, particularly entrepreneurial resources within the Porto area, maybe even across Portugal or the Iberian Peninsula. But how do these network concepts apply to the resources that is needed for entrepreneurship? And in particular, do the news vendor model, or I didn't quite catch, was that the firefighter model? I thought that was interesting. How would that apply in terms of networks for entrepreneurship, or maybe even more specifically, how do you balance the capacity and flexibility and distribution of control over resources, and even kind of connecting back to Madeline's question of what would a study of this look like? What would the variables, hypothesis, and design of experiments look like to try to answer this question of how do these networks of uncertainty and flexibility apply to entrepreneurial resources? What are you grinning at there?
I'll have to be very creative to answer that.
Well, keep it high level.
So I don't have an answer, but so maybe one place to start is so there are some generic models of supply, some generic supply and demand models for entrepreneurship. So these are from economics, from the economics area. So I would probably start by looking at those models. They are very, top level, very high level models, and try to understand how. But it's not clear for me right now what the steps would do. So this is just how I would probably start thinking about it, and I think it's a very interesting question. Is just looking at these very high level supply and demand models, and then just start thinking a bit more deeply on what that demand actually may consist of. Maybe there are different areas where the area, the region has some potential. Again, you could use that to start thinking about areas where you can build flexibility. You might think that in order to be able to start taking advantage of opportunities in a certain area, you would need to combine some of these resources. So maybe the capital can be, human capital can be these resources. So that's probably the way that I would start thinking of how these ideas could be bridged. But I think it's a great question. Yeah.
I just was struck with your with the chart that had the different types of networks, such as dedicated or flexible, and maybe starting out by characterizing what resources fit into what category, because there are some dedicated resources probably inefficiently used. And so I think this kind of network approach for entrepreneurial resources could really be interesting. Well done
so
again.
From the capability side, thinking of what different types of actors you need, universities,
Right.
human capital, existing businesses, so start playing with these and see if you could develop this kind of model with some useful insight for this. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes and we have 6 people that can participate. So I really ask you to be very short. So the next, I would like to ask Carlos Engler if he wants to make a really short question or comment.
Okay, thank you. I'll do my best. Short questions is not my middle name, but anyway, I'll try. João, as you know, there are many definitions of flexibility and robustness, and these issues and concepts are nowadays pervasive in almost all papers without a proper definition of the concepts at outset, which something I don't like very much. It's not the case in your work. But regarding more the mathematical programming side of robustness and which we could call robust programming, you have the works by Bert Siemens at MIT, then Talan Nevirovsky, Kuvelis and you, and etc. And in principle, finding solutions that edge against the most against the worst plausible outcome will lead to very conservative or even pessimistic approaches. And so maybe it's the right path would be to balance some robustness versus some opportunity, adopting a balance between a more optimistic and a more pessimistic stance regarding this. The price of robustness is a very interesting issue, and it's, by the way, the title of one of Bert Siemens' papers. And my second question was, can't we deal with this type of problems, flexibility, robustness, we will not have the time to make a precise definition of this. Can't this be modeled as games, in particular Stackelberg games? And I think you mentioned Stackelberg games in the context of transmission network planning.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if. Can you elaborate a bit on what would be the structure of the game? I'm not sure if you meant that if we can.
It's if you can recognize some kind of hierarchical decision there, some kind of to put it in a more clear way, some kind of leader-follower structure there, without precising what is the leader or the follower in this context. It can be games against nature.
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to make actions to which you have a response you cannot control, but influence your outcome in this sense.
So if I understood the question correctly, I would imagine that yes, that it is possible. I'm not sure if depending on the situation, if the Stackelberg relationship is there or is very strong. And so if as an alternative, you might instead consider a multi-objective, for instance, a multi-objective framework to study how these different properties at different levels might have some kind of influence between them. But so possibly depending on how expressive that conditioning of actions for that are related to one of the properties, how that conditioning is more or less expressive. Maybe a game structure could be interesting to explore that.
Yeah,
I'm not fully sure if I understood your question. So if my comment goes in the right direction.
No, but it's an issue, yeah. Whether or not you can model this in a multiple objective way in which the decision makers, loosely speaking, are at the same level, and a non-dominated solution for a multiple objective problem is never worse than the optimal solution for a Stackelberg for a high-level test. So, but maybe it's a line of research that deserves some attention in this context. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now 5 minutes, so I'm sorry to the next 3 members of the jury, Ana Póvoa, Aurora Teixeira, and José Manuel Mendonça, but I'll have to skip your questions and comments because the other 2 colleagues had not chance yesterday to speak, so I'll give the word to Jorge Manuel Pinto Sousa, who's a professor at DEGI at Phil.
Okay, thank you.
2.5 minutes for question and answer, please.
Yes. Thank you very much. As you may understand, it's a bit difficult for me to be completely neutral in assessing the CV and the performance of João because I've known him for a long time, and this assessment is somehow biased by our friendship. So in fact, we have worked a lot during several years during the PhD period, and also in supervising several doctoral students, and this is a very enriching experience and not easy sometimes, but I would like just to state 2 or 3 things about this, and in particular to emphasize the fact that we had a PhD student, Edgar Jimenez, where we had the honor and the enormous pleasure of working with Richard, and that was surely a great experience. But in fact, this is also an opportunity to emphasize the fact that the collaboration with MIT in the framework of the MIT Portugal program strongly contributed to the development of a new attitude or culture that was somehow emphasized here in our broad areas of research with an engineering systems perspective. And I must say I learned a lot working with João, but probably the main lesson learned was this somehow innovative way to address problems deserving research where formal approaches and models should have real impacts in companies and society. Nevertheless, I would like to highlight in his path, which is quite unique and exceptional, 1 or 2 points, and I will finish with a very short question. I think we have to recognize João's career is built upon incredibly risky challenges and decisions that in the end, and I would say somehow surprisingly, were always very successful. It seems that João deals very well with uncertainty, probably using sophisticated methods to do that in his personal and professional career. And in this way, I think João has several achievements that mainly result from, I would say, putting together and blending pieces of a puzzle that seemed not to fit together. This interdisciplinary approach to address complex problems, or I would say rather problematic situations in innovative ways. So this leads me to one question. A very short question. I would like, which comes in line with all the discussions of these 2 days. It's a kind of provocative question, obviously, and is somehow this career and this question reflects what will be the future, obviously. And this question is, João, see it as a provocative question. You don't need to answer. How do you see the alignment of your different interests and possibilities? And in line with this, does your role at Inesctec that you have emphasized here a lot, does it compromise or potentiate your path, particularly in terms of other academic functions? I give you the word, but I should say, just to finish, that I want to publicly say that I'm extremely proud of having João as a colleague and especially as a friend. Thank you, João, and congratulations for your incredible career and performance along all these years. I don't know if you want to, if you react to my provocative question.
Yes, and I think it's, I will react in the same line that I already reacted yesterday to the comment by Carlos Engler on the final page of my curriculum. And so I have been in the board of Idesc now for quite some time, since 2015 and since 2018 as the CEO. And I know that I have to divide the time, but at the core, I am an academic. And as an academic, I do everything that an academic needs to do. So I teach, I research, I do outreach, and I help with the management of my institution. And I think that all of this, including the role that I have at Inesctec, is mutually helpful and mutual reinforcing. I have to be more strategic, I have to be more selective, but there are a number of things that I don't compromise with, and I've had good role models, and I've had good recognition regarding that. So it's not bragging about it, but clearly my experience at Inesctec, and for instance the breadth of knowledge that I have about the research that is done in this institution is extremely helpful in many of the courses that I teach. So I'm teaching a new course this semester on business models for the digital economy, and the knowledge that I have about the work that my colleagues are doing in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, services management, etc., is extremely helpful in the way that I am leading that course. I have a good understanding of what's happening and what are the trade-offs if I want to discuss servitization, if I want to discuss new models that are data-driven, if I want to discuss the challenges of cybersecurity. So the position that I am in clearly helps with that. And I have not felt, and my students have not felt, any change in the quality of my pedagogical work. And I have had that recognized not only by the students, but also by my colleagues. And I could go on and explain how I think that is also has synergies with research, but time is finite, and then the other thing that I recognize is that I have to be more selective and I have to be more strategic. But there are synergies, and I'm building on those.
Obrigado, João, muitas felicidades. E o resto da conversa fica para um copo que fica presencial daqui a algum tempo. Thank you very much.
Amanhã já faço o teste e espero.
Thank you very much. I will not translate the few words in Portuguese, but now I'll give the word to José Fernando Oliveira, who's the director of the Industrial Engineering Management Department at Phil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Dear all, dear João. 99% of the time being head of the department is a pain in the neck. Is hard work, is solving problems, trying to keep people moving and with, let's say, with good results. 1% of the times it is a moment of happiness, of plenitude, of feeling that everything is worthwhile. This is one of those moments, João. You are someone very special, and a department that has you as an asset is a department that has not only the past and the present, but also a rich future. So thank you very much for all your work, for us all, for the department, for the faculty, for the university, and please don't give up, never. There is something that no one has commented until now, but I think that it is also very relevant. Usually things do not happen isolatedly. We all have noticed all the capacities, the capabilities, how extraordinary João is as a researcher, as a professor, because João loves to teach and keeps teaching, does not give up. And also as a manager, that part we also suffer a little bit from his skills. But what no one said until now is that João is an extraordinary person. He's a really good person that cares about the others, that is really helpful, tries to provide the best environment he can for everyone that works with him and that works in general. So he's someone that has a good heart. And we need that in academia. He does not keep things for him, he shares, he distributes. And that is also part of being a great academic. So once again, João, thank you very much and see you around.
Taking that as a question, José Fernando, I would like to say that I have amazing role models that have exactly the same characteristics.
Okay, so it's up to me to close these sessions, and I would like to say that I'm very happy to be here and among outstanding number of people in the committee, and not only in the committee. I cannot see the audience, but I guess the compliment also goes to the audience. I must say that I don't agree with José Fernando about the 99% of not good things and 1% of good things. I don't believe him and I don't agree with him.
You caught me in a bad moment, but
at least I can say about myself something different. I would shift that around because I think we are, the people I'm seeing are very, very happy to be doing what they are doing almost all the time. And so I think that shows from the faces around us. So thank you very much. And I would like to say thank you very much also to the audience that has been with us for these past 2 hours and a bit. And sorry for having to interrupt some of people who are going to have very good questions and comments. They can send them by email to me or to João directly. But we have to finish and we have to convene the jury. So thank you very much once again, publicly. Thank you. And we'll now go into a private session for the decision. Thank you.